All right, get ready to dive into some seriously heady stuff today, folks, because we're tackling Guy Debord's The Society of the Spectacle.
Still so relevant, isn't it?
It's crazy how ahead of his time Debord was, right? Published back in '67, but it feels like he was writing about our world today. It's a challenging read, though, no doubt. So
Yes.
for our listeners, we're going to break down those key ideas, make sense of it all, and then most importantly, we're going to see how those ideas play out in our world, almost 55 years later.
And that's the really interesting part, seeing how those ideas resonate even more strongly today.
Absolutely. So Debord kicks things off with this line, and it's a big one. The entire life of societies in which modern conditions of production reign announces itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything that was directly lived has moved away into a representation. Woof. Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. What's Debord getting at with this whole spectacle thing?
Right from the get-go, Debord throws us into his central concept, the spectacle. This idea that we have shifted from really living our experiences to just experiencing these representations of them. It's a profound observation.
So it's more than just like the images themselves, right? It's how this way of seeing the spectacle is like embedded into the very fabric of how our society functions.
Exactly. It's a social relation, but one that's mediated by these images. It's not that reality is replaced, but it's like our connection to it is filtered through this lens.
So not quite the Matrix, but
Not quite no, although
maybe we're getting there.
the board calls it the unrealism of the real society, which is just brilliant.
It really is. So much of our lives play out online these days. Is that an example of what he was talking about?
He was writing way before the internet, but you think about it, social media, it's all about presenting these like curated versions of ourselves, striving for those likes, that validation. It's this constant flow of images shaping how we see each other, how we see the world.
And how we see ourselves, which may be even more important.
Absolutely.
And speaking of things that shape how we see things, Debord also talks about how commodities play into all of this. He says, the spectacle is the moment when the commodity has attained the total occupation of social life. Okay, so break that down for us. What's the connection he's making between this spectacle and, like, stuff, buying things?
This is where he ties into Marx's concept of alienation. You've got this system, capitalism, where workers are separated from what they produce. They pour their time and energy into creating something, but
And they don't necessarily reap the rewards of that.
right, they're often alienated from the final product, from the true value of their labor, and the spectacle just reinforces that, you know?
Almost.
It bombards us with all these images of things we need to buy to be happy, to be successful. It fuels this insatiable desire for more, a desire that can never really be satisfied.
So we're stuck on this treadmill, working to buy, buying to be happy, but it's never really enough.
Exactly. And the more we buy into it, the more alienated we become. From ourselves, from genuine connection, from, well, everything.
And it's not even just about the buying, is it? It's like Debord even says that the spectacle consumes our time. The spectacle is the false consciousness of time. That's a powerful statement. What did he mean by that?
Yeah, Debord was fascinated by time, how we experience it, how it's shaped by society. He talks about two types of time. You've got cyclical time, like natural rhythms, days, seasons. And then there's linear time, historical time, this sense of moving from the past into the future. And he says the spectacle really messes with both.
Okay, so how does it distort our sense of time?
Well, think about it. We're constantly bombarded with news, trends, advertise. It's like this feeling of an endless present, right? Everything's fleeting, replaceable. We lose that connection to the past, and it makes it hard to even imagine a future that's meaningfully different.
Yeah, it's like we're stuck on this treadmill, chasing the next dopamine hit, the next viral video, the next sale. It's exhausting.
Exactly. And this ties into what he says later. There was history, but there is no more. Which, he doesn't mean history literally vanished. It's more like the spectacle warps how we relate to it.
So it's like history is just another thing to consume, another form of entertainment.
Exactly. We get these like sanitized, bite-sized versions of it, documentaries that oversimplify complex events, historical dramas that care more about entertainment than accuracy.
Style over substance.
Yeah, and we consume these representations of the past, but we don't really engage with, like, the messiness of it all, the nuances, We don't learn the lessons it has to teach us.
And that's what Debord wants us to see, right? How the spectacle keeps us from really grappling with history, using it to understand where we are now and where we might be going.
Exactly. He wants us to use it, right? Not just consume it.
You know, one thing that I found really interesting was what Debord said about cities and the countryside. He said, universal history is born in the cities, but then he also talks about this, like, liquidation of the city, which sounds kind of ominous. What did he mean by that?
Well, he saw cities as this like double-edged sword. On the one hand, he saw their potential, the historical progress, the mixing of cultures and ideas, a place where change could happen. But he also saw how the spectacle was twisting urban life, distorting it.
So, like, cities becoming all about consuming, all about entertainment.
Yeah, think about it. The rise of malls, big box stores, these sprawling suburbs, these spaces that encourage us to buy, but, it often comes at a cost. Community, public spaces, genuine connection, they all get pushed aside.
So it's like these urban spaces, they start to resemble the isolation that Debord saw in the pre-modern countryside, but it's a new kind of isolation, driven by, well, by the spectacle.
You got it. And that urban-rural dynamic, it's more relevant than ever, right? People moving to the suburbs, working remotely. I think Debord would have a lot to say about those trends.
Yeah, I'd love to hear his take on all that. So with this kind of bleak picture he paints, is there any hope? Can we break free from the spectacle, or are we stuck? I mean, he talks about revolution, doesn't he?
Yeah, revolution was definitely part of his thinking, but, he wasn't talking about a traditional Marxist revolution storming the barricades. He saw those old models as, well, kind of limited, even prone to just recreating the problems they were trying to solve.
Which makes sense, given how critical he was of movements like Marxism, anarchism, even Leninism, Stalinism. He seemed to be calling for something totally different.
He was. For Debord, true revolution wasn't just about seizing power, redistributing wealth. It had to be deeper than that. It was about a fundamental shift in consciousness, like a total transformation of how we experience the world, how we relate to it.
So less about tearing down the existing structures and more about changing our whole way of being, our thinking, our seeing everything. Did he give any examples of what that might look like?
Well, he pointed to the idea of workers' councils as a model, this idea of a more democratic, more participatory way of organizing society.
So these top-down power structures.
Yeah.
Something that's more decentralized, more grounded in the needs of everyday people. Pretty radical stuff.
It is. And that was a Debord, always challenging the status quo, pushing people to think differently. But, and this is important, he also said that real revolution couldn't just be about changing those external structures. It had to start internally. It had to start with us.
So cultivating critical thinking, being willing to challenge what the spectacles hold on us.
Exactly. And that brings us to that really powerful line from the book. The spectacle is ideology par excellence, because it exposes and manifests in its fullness the impoverishment, the servitude, and the negation of real life. It's a harsh judgment on, well, the systems that control so much of our lives, often without us even realizing it.
It's kind of terrifying when you think about it like that.
It is, and Debord wants us to wake up to that, to see how these systems work, to recognize the ways they limit us. Because he believed that once we can see through the spectacle's illusions, we can start to take back control, create a way of life that's more authentic, more meaningful.
Okay, that's empowering, but, and maybe this is a big but, how do we actually do that?
Yeah.
Debord was writing in a different time. How do his ideas about resisting the spectacle, how do they work in our world today when the internet, social media, just like the constant information overload?
It's the big question, isn't it? And it's one we all have to wrestle with. But Debord gives us some tools. He pushes us to be more aware of the information we consume, to question the narratives we're being sold, to be wary of those easy answers, those quick fixes.
So be skeptical. Don't just accept everything we see and hear.
Exactly. And cultivate experiences, connections that exist outside the spectacle. Time in nature, meaningful conversations, being creative. These are all ways to reconnect with, well, our own humanity. Ways to resist.
This is about making choices, living more consciously, less on autopilot.
Absolutely. And, I think Debord would also encourage us to get creative, to find ways to subvert the spectacle, fight back with its own tools. Think about street art that critiques consumerism, or online communities that encourage critical thinking.
So resistance doesn't have to be this big dramatic thing. It can be these small acts, these everyday disruptions, just injecting a little critical thought into our lives.
Exactly. And just becoming aware of the spectacle, recognizing its influence. That's a powerful act in itself. It's the first step.
This has been, wow, a real eye-opener. Debord is challenging, for sure, but so relevant. Thanks for walking us through it.
Anytime. Happy to dive in with you.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll leave you with one last thought from Debord. The spectacle is not a collection of images, but a social relation among people, mediated by images. So as you go about your day, your week, think about that, how those social relations are playing out in your own life. How are images shaping how you see, how you want, how you interact? And what can you do to take back control, live a life that's more authentically you?
That's something to think about.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.